Welcome to the World Class Coaching Podcast, where we promote the constant pursuit of development and focus on what really counts towards improving performance in elite sport. I'm Matt Dickens, and this is episode 4 of the World Class Coaching Podcast. Today, I'll be talking with Rich Blagrove, who leads the undergraduate program in strength and conditioning science at St Mary's University. We discuss strength training for endurance runners, considerations for concurrent training in all sports, and some of Rich's latest research. Later on, I also review David Epstein's The Sports Gene, and of course mention all upcoming CPD and job opportunities that are out there at the moment. Hey Rich, it's great to have you on the line.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Matt.
My pleasure. Rich, could you just start by telling the listeners about how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. At the minute, I'm Programme Director for the Undergraduate degree in Strength and Conditioning Science at St Mary's University. Been in this role now for 7 or so years, I think. Originally started out as a lecturer on the programme, then took over as programme leader about 4 or so years ago. Prior to that, I was actually a full-time strength and conditioning coach at Loughborough University. I was there for around about a year or so. And prior to that, I was actually a lecturer in further education, and I sort of started getting into strength and conditioning by working with the basketball and football team that were essentially like feeder teams into semi-professional basketball and football teams. And I was doing that on a voluntary basis, so I guess I sort of learnt my trade and started picking up some really valuable experience working with those under-18s, and that sort of led to the full-time role at Loughborough. And then I was able to combine the lecturing and the coaching as part of the position I've got now at St Mary's.
Oh, fantastic. And Rich, you've just released a book, Strength Training for Endurance Running.
I have indeed, yeah. It came out 2 weeks ago now, I think.
Yeah? Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
So what brought you to writing the book, and who's it sort of aimed at?
The opportunity first arose through the UK Strength and Conditioning Association, actually. Somebody put me in touch with the publishers because they were looking for a number of authors to write on a series of books around strength and conditioning. And because of the experience that I've built up over the years working with endurance runners primarily, my name was put forward for that. So I kind of ummed and ahed for a while because of the other responsibilities I've got here, including research and the coaching that I was doing and the role with the programme. But I really wanted to sort of get down my thoughts on paper and sort of my philosophy around working with endurance runners, because I get a lot of inquiries from runners and their coaches, both at the university and outside of the university. And I wanted to kind of help them out, really. Like, I haven't got all the time in the world to be replying to emails and taking on tons and tons of new athletes. So it was really for runners of all ages and abilities that were looking to include a little bit of strength and conditioning as part of their training, but perhaps don't have the specialist knowledge and the coaching support that you need in order to incorporate strength and conditioning type activities.
Oh, fantastic. So it's kind of aimed at all levels of endurance runners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main runners I've worked with based at St Mary's are certainly what you consider elite, like very well-trained athletes, and the majority operating at international standard. But the principles that I put across, a lot of the ideas that I present in the book are certainly appropriate for any age and ability of athlete. I kind of actually made a point of sort of stating that you don't necessarily need a lot of fancy equipment. You don't necessarily need to buy an expensive gym membership to do a lot of effective strength and conditioning exercises. So I sort of made sure that it targets those types of runners as well that don't have access to that sort of specialist equipment.
Oh, that's really great. Rich, in your experience, so what would you say are some of the common mistakes made when training for endurance running?
Quite a few, and this is sort of partly based on experience of working with runners. I've actually got a chapter in the book which is sort of based around kind of myth busting, if you like, and sort of a lot of the preconceptions that a lot of endurance runners have got about, well, weight training or resistance training in particular. But I think the biggest mistake that runners make is not including strength training and resistance type activities in their program, because they think, or they associate it with bodybuilding and with increases in muscle mass, which is obviously going to be detrimental to endurance running performance, which just simply isn't the case. I mean, both the research evidence and the anecdotal experience that I've got of working with runners shows that they can improve their performance, they can get benefits in terms of reducing injury risk without putting on any sort of muscle mass, which is going to lead to a reduction in their performance. So I say that's the main mistake that runners make, sort of disregarding weight training as an activity that might benefit them. I think another big area is probably around the fact they don't think they've got time to include strength and conditioning, and particularly as runners improve their standard and they're training more and more frequently and start training twice a day and so on, they can't find space in the week to fit any additional training activities like strength and conditioning. So the way that I generally program for endurance runners, and certainly a key message of my book, is that you can divide strength and conditioning exercises and activities that are beneficial into smaller training units, which are kind of dotted all the way through the week. So the frequency of S&C is quite high. So rather than looking at it as, okay, I've got to fit 2 sessions in the week and the sessions have got to be an hour, 7 to 70 minutes long, it's a case of squeezing in just maybe 10, 15 minutes of exercises, either before or after training runs. And that way you can actually accumulate a fairly large amount of time of strength and conditioning, and that can be really, really beneficial for runners. So that's definitely a mistake that I hear them saying, that they're not willing to take out running from their program. So how on earth can they fit in other training sessions that aren't running?
So it sounds like you're really plugging a much more manageable way of accumulating the volume of strength training.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's just more realistic for most runners to be able to do that, and so they don't have to look at it like, I've got to program an entire session and drop a run out of my training program, because it's just not realistic, and they're not really willing to do that. Trying to be a bit more pragmatic about it, I guess, and actually program around their running sessions and find ways to incorporate smaller blocks of time into the training week.
Oh, fantastic. And obviously, as we all know, there are benefits to every sport other than just playing the sport itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if as you answered like a few of the mistakes what endurance runners make,
Yeah.
Are there any particular mistakes that you've made and learned from that we can all learn from as well?
Trying to think of some specific examples. I guess it's first appropriate to point out that I've made tons and tons of mistakes over the years. I don't think you'd be a good coach, and I don't think you'd progress in your own career unless you were making mistakes all the time. I think what you're just trying to avoid is making mistakes so big that it either affects your career or it damages an athlete in some way. But I think the main message around this really is that coaches shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes. I think the best coaches certainly aren't afraid to make errors. And it's then just being open to criticism from others. That might be the technical coach, the physio, the athlete themselves, or colleagues who you're working with. But as long as you're learning from it, then people sort of don't hold these things against you for a long period of time. I can think of lots of times that I've sort of found that a certain training technique works well, or I've got a belief that a certain training activity is really, really effective, and I've just maybe pushed it a little bit too far, and an athlete's maybe picked up a little niggle, and it's not kind of damaged them long term, but I've kind of learned from that, and we've backed off from that particular training exercise or activity, and then found a balance in subsequent mesocycles and training phases. I think in a more sort of professional sense, I think the biggest mistake I'm constantly making is just taking on too much. Like, I think with the academic responsibilities I've got here, obviously, I'm very keen to carry on my own personal development with coaching. Taking on things like this book, a lot of research that I'm doing as part of my PhD, like I'm constantly just taking on more and more. And again, I think over time you sort of learned how to manage time effectively, be quite efficient with your time, and essentially knowing when to stop saying yes to people and taking on projects is actually a little bit of a skill that you develop over time.
Yeah, definitely. And we've all got to have a life outside of S&C as well. Some of us forget that.
Yeah, and I often forget what that's like as well.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Back to the athletes that you currently coach.
Yep.
Can you briefly discuss how their season is structured and thus your approach to programming throughout the season?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. I mean, the middle and long distance runners I work with, the majority are track athletes. So they've got a kind of long macro cycle where they're aiming to peak at some point during the summer. So they've got a long off-season build-up. So it's kind of a traditional type track and field athletes training year. I've got others that are marathon runners. So they'll generally run one, maybe two marathons a year. And those will sometimes be spring marathons or sometimes be autumn marathons. So their year's structured a little bit differently, but it's still kind of, I guess, a traditional macro cycle type design with the long off-season build-up. But I think in terms of the way then that I incorporate strength and conditioning around that, I think some of your listeners and perhaps yourself might be surprised to hear that a lot of the time with the endurance runners I work with, I don't tend to follow a traditional periodization model of going through a kind of anatomical adaptation type phase, then followed by strength, then followed by power, then followed by a sort of tapering phase, because a lot of the time where the athlete is at in terms of rehabilitating from an injury or the type of specific needs that they've got don't necessarily fit into that model. And I think it's something that I often tell a lot of our students, that just because the textbook says to do it in a certain way for a certain sport, it doesn't necessarily mean that every athlete needs to fit with that sort of blueprint and that sort of template that's being put across. And it's supposed to be designed for everybody. So I'm always keen very much to program for the athlete as opposed to program just for the sport or program based on what a review paper or a textbook says. And when I start working with a lot of the endurance athletes, I tend to, and I talk about this a little bit in my book as well, I tend to follow a very much kind of concurrent type design where if I identify kind of 5 or 6 key physical qualities or biomotor abilities that are important for endurance runners, there's actually an element of their strength and conditioning programming which is designed to develop each one of those qualities, and they're there all year round. And the reason that I program like that is because as an endurance athlete who generally doesn't have very much experience of strength and conditioning, they don't need very much stimulus, they don't need very much overload in order to create an adaptation. And so if I did say, okay, the purpose of this block is to improve basic strength, and every single exercise in that program was based around strength development, like they just don't need 2 sessions a week, 20 sets of exercises which are based around improving strength. I generally find they maybe need 6 to 8 sets of work and they can improve strength, which leaves a lot of time left in the session to do other bits and pieces. So certainly for the first year and sometimes 2 years, there's this very much concurrent or sort of multilateral development of a lot of different qualities. And then as they start to mature with their strength and conditioning and they start to plateau in areas of their training, then I do start to shift the emphasis just a little bit more. So they have a little bit more of a focused attention on certain physical qualities. And then that shifts across to others as we sort of move through training phases of mesocycles. But yeah, with a lot of the athletes I'm working with that aren't strength trained, I don't think there's a real need to sort of have a heavily structured, periodized model. It's based around the individual, it's based around where they're at on a week-to-week basis.
So obviously, you're kind of referring back to where you had that mistake with endurance runners that if they don't really strength train in the past or haven't done, then when they come to you, it doesn't take much to initiate an adaptation.
No, exactly, and like strength training is a good example of that. I think like plyometrics, without a shadow of a doubt, like from research and from the experience that I've had coaching, like plyometrics will give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of a training activity for endurance runners, just because of the reliance on the stretch shortening cycle as part of the running action. So particularly with well-trained endurance runners and some of the elite guys I work with, like, they're going to get major improvements in their performance if they can, well, A, spend a long period of time without an injury, but B, incorporate plyometrics regularly into their program. So, like, having said everything I just said about sort of this concurrent approach to training, like, the aim is to get them doing like a relatively decent volume of plyometric training. So they do need an underpinning level of strength in order to do that, and they generally won't hugely improve stretch shortening cycle function because it's part of their action unless you give them a decent overload. So I think strength training and plyometric training, yeah, like I've seen different responses with different types of athletes, but it's just about programming sensibly, program intelligently around getting them to the point that you want them to.
Oh, that's really interesting, Rich. And I guess you kind of alluded to there's not many periodization models in the textbook that really directly transfer to the real world.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, textbooks around planning and programming, they're obviously incredibly useful in terms of putting across principles. And it's the same with my textbook, but yeah, each individual you work with, each different sport that you move between as a coach is always going to have different demands. Athletes are going to have different backgrounds, and so you need to focus in on what the individual requires rather than what you think the sport requires or what you've done in the past with other types of performers.
Oh, absolutely. So strength and endurance, whilst interlinked, normally kind of sits at the opposite end of the training spectrum.
Yeah.
Perhaps more applied to other sports, but like most sports typically depend on concurrent training.
Yeah, sure.
Can you talk us through some of the mechanisms that may lead to an interference effect when you're looking for strength adaptations?
Quite a scientific question.
Well, I know you know quite a lot about this, Rich, so I wanted to get your advice on it as I've got you on the line now.
Yeah, no, sure. Yes, starting off with the first thing you mentioned, I mean, going back to a lot of the athletes we work with now are runners, and like I think there's 25, 30 peer-reviewed academic studies that have been done showing that strength training and explosive strength training improves physiological determinants, primarily running economy, with endurance athletes. But the problem is with those types of studies is they don't, obviously the end outcome is improvement of endurance performance rather than just trying to get stronger for the sake of getting stronger. So they don't tend to have a strength-only training group in their study design. So, like, looking at those 25 to 30 studies, you're not necessarily going to be able to establish whether there's any interference with strength adaptation. But the studies that have looked at that, so have had a strength-only training group and then a group which adds endurance training to a strength training regime, have generally found that strength adaptation tends to be compromised or blunted. So that really then applies to sports where strength and power is a much more important physical quality which underpins sports performance. So rugby being a prime example, American football, and particularly sports where like adding muscle mass is potentially an important part of programming. And so, yeah, the reason behind why we see that sort of blunting or compromised adaptation to strength, there's still quite a lot of research going on in this area. So there's been some speculation that it's purely just down to fatigue. So if you don't manage and control variables within a training week, if you've got too little recovery between a strength session and an endurance session, you potentially, if the strength session's second, you're going to compromise the quality of that strength session. So you're not going to get the same sort of adaptation compared to if you were just doing strength training by itself. Other people have speculated it's something more to do with sort of cumulative fatigue over a period of a few months. So if you're adding endurance training to a strength training program and you've maybe got an athlete that's doing strength training 3 or 4 times a week, they're essentially just getting more and more tired. You're just kind of adding more volume to their total amount of training. So something you might not notice for the first month or two, but after a few months, they're exhibiting the types of hormonal, immunological signals that suggest they're kind of reaching an overtraining type status. So when then the study takes some measurements, or when you retest an athlete, it kind of appears that they haven't improved, and it might be more that they're actually sort of experiencing some form of overtraining. And then there's this whole area around sort of interference at a molecular level, that we've obviously got separate signaling pathways which upregulate adaptation linked to strength exercise. So I'm particularly talking about a hypertrophy response here, so upregulation of protein synthesis. And then a separate signaling pathway which is responsible for upregulating endurance type adaptation, so particularly increases in size and number of mitochondria. And there's a fair amount of research showing that if you do a high volume of endurance training alongside strength training, then we actually get a blocking of the signaling pathway which upregulates protein synthesis. And so if it blocks it to a certain extent for maybe 8 hours after an endurance training session, if there's a strength training session which takes place within that 8 hours, then obviously the adaptation isn't going to be quite as effective as if the endurance session hadn't been there in the first place. So in terms of sort of minimizing it, I guess, yeah, I sort of alluded to a couple of things there. It's around sort of management of training variables within the training week and over a long period of time, making sure you're prioritizing certain objectives which either link to strength or endurance, but probably not both at the same time.
Fantastic. Is there any more specific advice you could give around how to structure that programming week, or with regards to, say, just strength training adaptations to maximize those?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say, which probably sounds quite obvious to a lot of coaches, is to make sure you separate out the sessions. So, I mean, the research which is combined sessions, so you go out and you do some sort of endurance session, which is either a long, slow distance type effort, or it's some sort of extensive interval training, and then straight away you go from that straight into the weights room and you're lifting weights. Like, that's definitely something you want to be avoiding. So the first thing is, if the time allows in the schedule, to split the sessions up and try and get as much recovery between the sessions as you can. And part of that recovery should be a consideration for nutrition, so appropriate quality and timing of protein intake in particular. And just making sure the athletes are rested and recovered before they do the second session. Like, there's been a little bit of thought around the order of the sessions, and I think in a couple of articles that I've written, I've suggested that it's better to do the strength training session later in the day. And like, some scientific studies don't support that, some do. But it makes more sense to have the strength training later on in the day, because if you've got this window of time after where we're seeing upregulation of certain signaling pathways, if the key objective is related to strength, like, you want the longest period possible. And so if an athlete's sleeping, if they're resting in the evening, if they're sleeping overnight and not training till the next day, that's going to usually be at least 12 hours. So you've got the longest window of time if you do the strength training session in the evening compared to the morning. I think the other bit of advice is, I kind of mentioned it before, around just prioritizing objectives. So if for a 6-week mesocycle, you prioritize that you want to try and drive improvements in VO2 max, let's say, like, it's not to say you don't do strength training, like, that certainly goes on in the background, but you might accept that for that 6 weeks, you might just try and maintain some qualities, particularly if the athlete's very, very well strength trained. And then you're prioritizing some extensive or quite intense type interval training sessions to try and drive changes in VO2 max. And equally, when the emphasis then is meant to shift across, so back over to prioritizing gains in muscle mass or gains in maximum strength, you let the endurance training take a back seat. So you may be just doing a little bit of that in the background, or maintaining it even through technical training practices, because the priority is on the strength and you don't want anything interfering with that at all. So there's a few there. Don't know if you wanted any more. I think the other one that there's definitely been some decent research around is mode of training. So like, generally, running type activities tend to have more interference than non-weight bearing activities like cycling and swimming and potentially rowing. So I guess if you're working with a rugby team or some athletes that will require increases in muscle mass, like, picking cycling, swimming, rowing might lead to less interference than if you send them out on runs or some running interval training type sessions. So yeah, that's probably a useful bit of advice as well.
Oh no, that's Rich. That's some really useful advice, really practical, and a really comprehensible summary that you've just given there. So thank you very much. Finally, Rich, if we kind of move on to your current research, I know the last time we spoke, you were in the middle of collecting a lot of data. What are you looking at now?
Yeah, I'm still in the middle of that. So at the moment, I'm doing a quite big study as part of my PhD, which is looking into the effect of a resistance training intervention on physiological outcomes and risk factors for injury in a group of endurance runners, but the endurance runners are aged 15 to 18, so looking at mainly adolescent athletes. Really because, as I mentioned before, there's a ton of literature around benefits of strength training for well-trained and elite endurance runners, but not very much looking at younger athletes that have made a decision to specialise in the sport. So all of the athletes I'm using, I've been lucky enough to get a pretty decent standard of runner. So some of the 17, 18-year-olds are operating at international junior level, and the majority have competed at sort of national schools type level. So they're all pretty fit young athletes. They've just never done any strength and conditioning before. So the first question is around, okay, do we see the same type of benefits to performance, particularly from an economy perspective, if we include strength training in their program compared to a group that doesn't do any strength training? And secondly, can we change any risk factors associated with injury? So we're looking at landing mechanics from both bilateral and unilateral jumping. We're looking at hip strength, both in extension and in an abduction pattern, because we've got links there to particularly knee injury, but other injuries which endurance runners tend to get, also around the ankle and places like that. So can we improve that? And also some other biomechanical measures linked to sort of fundamental movement skills. There's some correlations with poor movement and injury risk as well. So if we don't see any improvements to performance, like we're fully expecting to change these risk factors associated with injury. So using that as a selling point to the coaches that work with young endurance runners, will be really, really good, I think.
And how long is that intervention?
It's 10 weeks. So at the moment I'm just into week 3 of the intervention. So tested 24 runners. So we've got 12 in the intervention group and 12 in a control group who are just running. And they're matched on age and performance. And so, yeah, the intervention's 10 weeks long. They're doing, it's just general strength and conditioning, like a strength and conditioning session twice a week. Which is going to be progressive. It's got an element of periodization to it to some extent. And then we're retesting them in the sort of couple of weeks before Christmas. So hopefully we'll be able to know some results early in the new year.
Oh, that sounds really good, Rich. What measures of running? What are you looking at to measure running economy specifically?
So it's on the physiology test. We do 2 things. We do what's called a sort of ramp protocol or a step test, where the athletes start running at a relatively slow speed for their performance level. So for these guys, it's generally 12, 13 kilometers an hour. And then each 3 minutes, we go up a kilometer an hour for 5 stages. And then we're able to generate a lactate profile off that and equivalent for heart rate and rating of perceived exertion. So as part of those measurements as well, they're wearing a gas mask. So we can collect expired air, so we know what VO2 they're exhibiting at those various different speeds. And one of the other things we're going to look at is the speed or the velocity for certain levels at certain points on the lactate curve. So what velocity they're putting out for 2 millimoles, 3 millimoles, 4 millimoles, and we're going to see if those points change across the 2 groups.
Oh wow, that sounds great. And when do you expect to kind of get that research wrapped up and published? And sometime next year, I presume.
Yeah, we're lucky enough to have a small amount of funding from the British Milers Club, actually. And so I need to present the results to them in kind of like April, May sort of time. So hopefully have all the data collected, barring massive dropouts and injuries. Hopefully have all the data collected this side of Christmas. So then it'll be a case of analysing all of the data files up until about Easter time, and hopefully we'll have some relatively firm conclusions by April, May that we can present to the British Milers Club.
Oh, fantastic. Well, good luck with the rest of the research.
Thank you.
Rich, thanks for that. We'll take a short break and come back with a couple of last short questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, excellent.
Question time. This is the part of the show where I'll put a couple of regular questions to my guests regarding their morning routines, their go-to learning resources, their approach to influencing technical staff, and it's also your opportunity to ask a question, as I will pick one or two in advance from the ones that you send me. So, Rich, I'm a big believer in creating a positive environment and being a positive influence. Do you have any rituals such as morning routines or even just having a strong coffee that you go through to ensure that you're in the best status of mind prior to working with your athletes? And is this any different before you give a lecture to your students?
Well, I definitely have a strong coffee every morning. Not so much a ritual or a superstition. It's purely physiological. It's purely as a stimulant. I'll usually have a couple of strong coffees before I've got a coaching session early or a lecture early. It definitely makes me feel a little bit more alert, but it's not so much of a ritual, rather, like I say, a bit more functional, I guess. But no, yeah, I was reading your recent blog actually around this same topic about creating a positive environment, and like I agreed with so much of it, and hopefully it's if you're all right with it, it's something we'll try and use with our students here at St Mary's a little bit as sort of a statement around philosophy, as a decent example. But yeah, I'm like in coaching athletes, I'm a big believer in trying to be a role model towards them. So in a number of different ways. So simple stuff like making sure that you're punctual to sessions, that you're organised for sessions, the programs are written, any equipment, kits out, and the session's ready to roll when they arrive. But also in terms of sort of practicing what you preach. So just being able to do skills yourself to a relatively competent level and sort of knowing what you're talking about, really. So if you're challenged by the technical coach or the physio, you've got reasons and rationale for everything you do, so it comes across as being professional. So people, the athletes and certainly the students here, can sort of look up to you to some extent.
Oh, well, no, Rich, I really appreciate that. Yeah, of course, you're welcome to use it. No, thanks for that. That's some great feedback. Thank you. I wasn't expecting you to say that. So question number 2, possibly one of the hardest parts of the job as an S&C coach is influencing other members of the support staff, especially technical coaches. How do you deliver this message to your university students, and who do you have to influence in your job?
I guess, 2 parts to that question, really. I think I'm relatively lucky over the years with endurance running coaches to have worked with a lot that have been relatively open-minded and willing to take on board new ideas linked to strength and conditioning and sort of wider sports science as well. But at the same time, I've had to work alongside others that are very much resistant to it. So an athlete that I've inherited from either another coach or has approached me because they want some help rehabilitating from an injury or something, and then we implement a proper strength training program off the back of that. The coach tends to be a little bit resistant and reticent to including those types of activities because of the reasons we spoke about before, around interfering with running training, around the fear of causing soreness and bulking up and that sort of thing. And so, like the way I try and educate students is to try and find some common ground initially. I think if you can find some common ground, then you feel like you've sort of got some kind of shared ownership and responsibility over the athletes program then, and just sitting down with them and explaining to them in a very sort of civilized, non-confrontational manner what the benefits are to the program that you're trying to implement. And a lot of the time, coaches will either come around or they'll be willing to give it a go at least, and then hopefully they can start to see some of the benefits that come with the program that you're looking to implement. I think some of the most challenging situations at working with other practitioners is usually physios, and I think that's often because the biggest problem with endurance runners is just injury, and like one of the major objectives that I've got as a strength and conditioning coach working with endurance runners is trying to minimize injury risk. So if athletes are picking up niggles and they're suffering setbacks with injury, like invariably they're going to go to a physio, they're going to see a physio. The physio's going to have an opinion on firstly what's caused the injury, but secondly how they should be rehabilitating from it. And we don't necessarily then see eye to eye on those things. So again, it's often finding some compromise and some common ground around the best way forward for the athlete, and never forgetting that the athlete's sort of the most important person in the whole relationship. So a lot of the time, I think S&C coaches have kind of got to park their ego to some extent and sort of, okay, they want to implement a certain program of work with an athlete. They're convinced it's going to work, but there's barriers being put in place by the physio and maybe the technical coach, which prevent you from doing that. So you've sometimes got to accept that your way might not be the best way forward, and you're going to try somebody else's strategy and maybe then start incorporating some of your work further down the line.
I can kind of, just branching on from what you're saying there, I can kind of see you must get caught in quite a cycle of, if athletes are picking up little niggles, probably due to not tolerating the volume of training, and then you're trying to make them stronger to tolerate, so they have a higher tolerance to training, but that's just going to go round in circles.
Yeah.
Where one person won't let you do one thing that will help reduce the chance of them getting the problem that they've got in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just getting a sustained enough period of time, I guess, so to drive those adaptations that you want, and then usually what comes with that is an increase in volume and or intensity of running as well. So then that increases the risk of injury by itself. But I think something which kind of overlaps a lot of the areas that we've spoken about on the podcast is just educating athletes around, well, A, the importance of strength and conditioning, but B, just learning about their bodies. And like the athletes, the best athletes that I've worked with that have had very, very long periods of time without injuries, where they've been running 100 plus miles a week and not suffered a setback for talking years rather than months, are the ones that are very, very tuned into their bodies. And they listen to physios, they listen to S&C coaches, but they know when to back off, when not to back off, and what types of exercise or recovery strategies they need to put in place in order to get over a little niggle around a muscle or some sort of area of tightness or stiffness which they know is probably going to lead to an injury. And it's those sensible ones that make progressions year on year, because they have uninterrupted periods of training, that kind of makes you look like a better S&C coach ultimately. It's like, look, they haven't had an injury for this period of time, but it's nearly always the athlete who's been very, very sensible and has just kind of used you as somebody to support the process.
Oh, massively. I heard Ashley Jones actually refer to himself as an educator, like, above being an S&C coach recently, and that's something that I hugely fall into and really agree with. So I think that part of our job is hugely underrated and massively important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been an eye-opener doing this research study where we're implementing strength and conditioning with these young athletes, because there can be a lot more influence at that sort of age, and you can drill in the right sort of behaviours and education. So, but like some are very open to it. You can see some doing the right things very, very quickly, and those are probably going to be the ones that succeed. Whereas other ones tend to be a little bit slower getting into good routines and good habits. So I think education is important, but again, it's then how you can influence individuals, and that's always going to be a little bit different again.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thanks, Rich. Question number 3. If you can recommend just one website, newsletter, podcast, and book to other S&C coaches, what would they be?
Difficult question, that. You mean other than Matt Dickens's podcast?
Other than this podcast itself, yeah.
A lot. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I read, I guess it kind of relates to my role here at St Mary's as program director. That it's usually going to be research articles, review articles linked to whatever lecture I'm preparing for or whatever the recent publications are. So I know that probably sounds like a really unhelpful answer to a lot of coaches and practitioners out there, but I mean, I rely quite heavily on the book edited by Marco Cardinale. So Strength and Conditioning, Biological Principles, Practical Applications. I think that's excellent in terms of underpinning science. It was published a few years ago now, but it's still a great textbook, and I recommend that to a lot of students. I really like. I don't know if you look at Andy Franklin's newsletters that come out, where he sort of reviews various different publications that have come out over the course of the week and has a bit of a commentary on them. Like, I think they're good from a sort of critical analysis type perspective. Saves you a bit of time as well. And I think, like a lot of coaches these days, I spend quite a lot of time on Twitter. So, I mean, and not really even following anybody specifically, but a range of top academics and coaches, and the wisdom that's shared on Twitter and some of the discussions that are had between various practitioners is really, really insightful. And yeah, I think a few years ago that would have sounded a bit strange, but I think most coaches use that as a source of education now. So spend some time on Twitter as well.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny you mentioned Marco Cardinale's book. Actually, I was listening to his podcast on Lauren Bannock's Guru Performance podcast just the other day. Very insightful, and they're actually talking about whether he may do an update of that book in the next year or so as well. So that would be something to look out for.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if he doesn't.
No, it's a great resource for sure. Finally, last question for you, Rich. For all the young and aspiring coaches out there, what would be your top piece of advice? Or even what's the one passing message you give to your students when they leave university with the intention of landing a job in elite sport?
I was looking forward to this question because last week I had the first years inducted into the course. So we spend a good few hours going through the philosophy of the course, the values, how to break into professional SSC, so on and so forth. And like the parting message that I leave with, or what I tell them, sounds a bit corny, but what I tell them to write on their bedroom walls is the ABC of becoming a successful strength and conditioning coach. And the A stands for attention to detail. So not only with their academic work in terms of presenting it and referencing and so on, but with the athletes that they're going to start to coach over the next couple of years, that they have a real eye for detail. So they try and become a perfectionist in terms of movement quality, understanding the technical model, and then working within the constraints of that technical model when they're coaching. So the more they can challenge themselves to reach that really, really high standard and be as much of a perfectionist as possible, will mean that they hopefully get the grades they want and they start developing their coaching skill quite quickly. The B stands for mastering basics. And I think a lot of what we do as strength and conditioning coaches is actually quite basic. And I think the best strength and conditioning coaches just actually do the basics very well. So understanding how we coach athletes to squat, how we coach athletes to do simple unilateral movements, pulls, pushes, trunk rotations, anti-rotations, like all of these basic fundamental movements, how to coach them well, and understanding a range of progressions and regressions to work with various different athletes, and also just understanding of fundamental biomechanics that underpin what we do as coaches, fundamental anatomy, again, so you can work alongside physios potentially, fundamental physiology. So understanding the fundamentals of the theory and the fundamentals of the applied practice gets you a very, very long way, I think, as a coach. And then finally, the C is continuous professional development. So always making sure that, and I think this goes for, well, certainly myself and the staff that I work with here at St Mary's, like everybody's constantly trying to better themselves. So people are constantly trying to identify areas of weakness, areas of gaps in their knowledge and their understanding, and ways that they can try and plug those gaps. And it means you sort of never settle as both a practitioner or an academic. You're always trying to improve your CV, always trying to improve your knowledge and understanding. And I think the second that you kind of turn around and kind of go, I'm kind of happy with where I am, or I think I've kind of made it. This is the point at which I wanted to get to in my career. You sort of, yeah, you're going to start to plateau off, and you're going to start to get complacent with your own practice, and that's when you sort of become a bad coach. So constantly looking for areas to develop yourself as a professional, I think, is really important as well.
I can see why you were looking forward to that, Rich. I think that answer is fantastic. Really good.
Thanks.
Thank you. So where can we find you on social media, Rich?
I'm on Twitter. I haven't got tons of followers, so yeah, hopefully this might generate a few more. Who knows? So yeah, my Twitter handle is @rich_Blagrove. Blagrove spelled Blagrove. And I mean, the St Mary's Strength and Conditioning course has got an account as well, so people can follow that, and we post a lot of things related to strength and conditioning research and applied practice on there, plus some sort of news features about the program and the students. So people might want to follow that as well.
Okay, Rich, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
No problem.
And I look forward to chatting again soon.
Yep, look forward to it too, man. Thanks for inviting me on.
My pleasure. Take care, mate.
Cheers. Bye.
The relevant reading section is aimed to highlight one article that I've either read or written and believe is worth sharing with you guys. It may be peer-reviewed or it might not be, but I will make sure it's relevant to coaches looking to develop and always get better. In this week's relevant reading section, I'm going to review David Epstein's take on the nature versus nurture debate through his brilliant book, The Sports Gene. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't read it already, the basic gist of the book is that both nature and nurture are important pieces of the puzzle. And as Charles Darwin's work observed, it could often be our environment over much longer periods of time that has influenced certain genetic traits across various populations in one way or another. To start with, I need to say how much I enjoyed reading this book. It has a fantastic narrative of stories that provide an education into genetics without you even realizing it. The book is brilliantly researched, and any fan of sports, especially those with a vested interest in the more sciencey side of things, are sure to find it a compelling read. Secondly, I need to admit that I've put off reading this book for quite some time. Personally, I choose to believe more in the nurture side of the equation, against talent, and more in the favour of hard work and skill acquisition. Mostly because there's nothing I can do about my genetics, and I like to think that we have control over our own destiny. I really like books such as Matthew Said's Bounce and Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and I thought that this book, if anything, and rightly so, was going to present more of an argument towards our innate natural abilities and genetic differences. Indeed, the sports gene certainly highlights and investigates some incredible genetic advantages that certain populations of humans may have towards certain sports. Personally, I found it fascinating that one reason Jamaican sprinters have a greater proportion of type 2 muscle fibers could be down to their ancestral roots on the west coast of Africa. One adaptation, or effectively a natural filter of people surviving in that region, was those who had lower oxygen levels in the blood were less prone to being bitten by mosquitoes and thus contracting malaria. Thus, an internal environment that serves best towards anaerobic energy production and fast twitch type 2 muscle fibers. Whereas at higher altitudes in eastern Africa, such as for the Kalenjin runners, where there is less oxygen in the air, not only means there are fewer mosquitoes, but there's also a great environment to produce high numbers of red blood cells. But it's not just down to muscle fiber type, because possibly all Jamaicans sprint at some point through school and college, and Epstein actually does a great job to present both sides of the equation. So the entire island acts as one giant talent ID sieve for the population, and good sprinters can be much easier recognized than compared to other countries where many young athletes play different sports and may not be identified as good sprinters. This is very similar to how so many young Canadians play ice hockey and the number of Brazilians who play football or soccer for our American listeners. Of course, that only adds to the sheer number of hours each of those young athletes accumulate playing their respective sports. But Epstein does highlight some flaws in the theory of the 10,000-hour rule, which was based on a study by Anders Ericsson and largely popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. He states that the number of hours towards mastery is more likely to be down to the individual, through which he takes a look at his experience as a runner as well as various other examples to bring our attention to the fact that as individuals, we can either have a high or low baseline and be either high or low responders to training, which is probably something as S&C practitioners we should all know anecdotally anyway, and indeed is a very important lesson to pass on to aspiring coaches. Each athlete will have his or her strengths and weaknesses. What works for one athlete may not work for another, and vice versa, what doesn't work for one athlete may actually still work for others. When we look at the research, there are always varying degrees of response to training interventions, which is why we must be careful of small sample sizes, because certain outliers, high responders or non-responders, can easily sway the overall conclusions. This stresses the importance of individualization within training programs. You need to know your athletes, not only what they respond best to, but also how much they can tolerate. And I can reiterate something that Rich Blagrove mentioned earlier, in that you're not coaching the sport, the athlete's position, or the structure of the season, you're coaching the individual. The human genome is incredibly complex, and the research is barely beginning to scratch the surface. However, our DNA extends far beyond the realms of just physical qualities. One fascinating example looked at how Alaskan sled dogs have been bred on their desire and determination to pull the sled, suggesting that our willingness to work hard could also be largely genetic. So, if any of you have got any lazy athletes in your camp, you might not like the sound of that idea. Another example related to our perception of pain and how that too is individual. How you experience a certain sensation of pain can be completely different to how somebody else experiences the same act. Maybe you can relate to this either when discussing what broken bone or dislocation hurt the most, or even if you've got a few tattoos. I've heard different people report the most painful places to be in completely different areas. Bear that in mind when your athletes report pain. It could just be muscle soreness, for example, but the same level of soreness can be more debilitating to some athletes than others. Just like some rugby players will play on without realizing they've even broken a bone, and some footballers scream at the slightest touch of their arm. In the final chapter, Epstein discusses Eero Mantiranta, a highly successful Finnish cross-country skier who has a genetic mutation that gives him an extraordinarily high red blood cell count. Clearly, most people would think that this is an advantage to his sport, as he'll consequently be able to carry more oxygen to his cells. However, Aero will argue that his advantage lay in his mental determination, not his higher red blood cell count. He states that any advantage he would have had would have been countered by an increase in the viscosity of his blood. Who knows? What is for sure is that if Aero never pursued cross-country skiing and trained tirelessly so that he could earn a job on the border patrol, and if that job didn't allow him the time to train further, I highly doubt he would have ever been an Olympic medalist. Being taller than 7 foot with an even larger wingspan may increase your likelihood of playing in the NBA, but I doubt you'll get there if you never pick up a basketball. So whether I like to admit it or not, Some people certainly have certain advantages for some activities, but at the end of the day, so many sports are multifaceted, and it's going to take a combination of your natural abilities alongside how you develop them that will determine your success. Like I said, I've really enjoyed reading this book and have merely skimmed the surface in this review. So if you haven't read it already, I would highly recommend doing so. Now it's time to discuss personal development. In this section, I'll let you know of any up and coming courses or conferences that I'm aware of. I'll also let you know of any decent jobs or internships that might be out there at the moment. As always, I'll put all the links that I'm about to mention, as well as those that are still relevant from previous episodes, up in the show notes on my website. I'm going to start today by pointing out that every few weeks or so, I'm now going to try and post the links to most of the articles I've read online and found interesting recently. A little like what Simon Nainby does, but it won't be anywhere near as extensive as his blog. You can find Si's around the web posts over on his blog at undergroundathletics.co.uk. Starting the CPD stuff with online content then. Just want to point out that I recently watched That Sugar film the other day. I think it's some essential viewing for just about anyone. So I'll put the link up for where I found it so that you can watch it if you want to. The GSK Human Performance Lab recently had a symposium on fatigue and performance, for which you can find the presentations up on their website if you join their community. Also, Alex Hutchinson's talk from the Endurance Research Conference is up on YouTube on brain training, neuroscience, and endurance performance, which is definitely well worth a watch. Lastly, Dan Baker will be presenting the first of Rob Pacey's new webinar series on Saturday, the 10th of October. So head over to Rob Pacey's website, Pacey Performance, and definitely sign yourselves up for that one. With regards to upcoming events that I haven't mentioned before, on the 10th of October is the Northern Undergraduate Sports and Exercise Medicine Conference at Newcastle University. Tickets are just from £4 to £10, and it looks like a decent event if you're up that way. On the 30th of October, Dr. Andy Franklin Miller is hosting a free, and I repeat, free sports medicine conference at Trinity College in Dublin. Speakers include the likes of Greg Meyer and Peter Wayand, so well worth the cost of flights from wherever you are in the world, and you can book that via conference at sportssurgeryclinic.com. If there was one event that I can plug this week, it would certainly be that one. I have mentioned Altis's apprentice coach program before, but they've just announced that Nick Winkleman will be joining Dan Pfaff and several others on their November edition of their apprentice coach program. So that's definitely worth checking out if you can head over to the States for a week in November. Alternatively, up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, from the 14th to the 15th of November, Joel Brannigan and Jared Deacon are hosting a Fundamentals of S&C workshop, which I imagine will also be well worth the money. There's a scientific conference for motor skill acquisition in Kisakallio in Finland on the 18th to 20th of November. So if you've got any Finnish listeners or anyone out that way, that could possibly be worth going over to. Anyone in Canada, particularly Ontario, should get themselves to the Hill Performance Coaching Summit on the 22nd of November, where Brett Bartholomew and Nick Winkleman will be joining Dan Noble and others. As for internships, I only got 2 this week. Millfield School in Bristol are looking for an athletic development intern. They're offering a pretty decent package, including a salary in the range of £9,000, accommodation and CPD, structure towards UKSCA and I believe NSCA accreditation. As well as Denstone College are also recruiting an S&C intern. I don't know much about that one, but contact Dan Pike on dpike@denstonecollege.net for more details. Finally, there's always a few jobs out there if you look hard enough. There are several postgraduate positions currently available with the Australian Sports Institute. When I say several, I mean about 10. So definitely head over to that website and check them out. I'll put the link up on the website. Bradford Bulls are looking for an assistant S&C coach to lead the academy development and assist with their senior team. The EIS are recruiting a senior S&C coach to work with the Army Elite Sport Programme. That sounds quite interesting, and I believe it's primarily to do with boxing and shooting to begin with. And finally, there's a rather big role with UK Athletics at the moment who are looking for a new head of sports science. So if you've got the experience, and only if you've got the experience, would you want to stick your nose in for that one? That's all for this episode. Thanks for listening, and catch you again soon. Thanks for listening to the World Class Coaching Podcast. You can catch me on Twitter at MattDickinsSC. The show notes for each episode will be up on the blog over at purehealthpuresport.co.uk, and obviously subscribe to the World Class Coaching Podcast on iTunes or wherever it is that you prefer to listen. Keep pushing forward your development and tune in again soon.